Chapter 16, Short Circuit. Memory grabbed Gregory's gun and aimed it at his head. Jeremy was in the middle of pulling the lever with both his hands to turn the supercomputer back on, gazing at the scene unraveling before him as if he had been hypnotized. The tower's golden glyphs regained their color as the young boy hoped he had saved his friends in time. Gregory gave the woman a cynical smile. "Just what do you plan on doing?" he said to her. "Shooting me down? That gun is a Desert Eagle. Its recoil is so strong that you'll break your nose. And you don't even know how to hold it correctly." Jeremy could see that Memory's muscles were tense under the effort of holding such a heavy gun straight. "Maybe so," responded the woman. "But I could also hit you by mistake. Drop the box to the supercomputer, get in the lift and leave the room." "Out of the question." Gregory took a step forward. Jeremy's gaze fell for a moment to his shoes. They were elegantly made with black varnish and leather soles that squeaked on the metal floor. He and Aelita's mother, on the other hand, were wearing sneakers with large, rubber soles. And that gave him an idea. He slipped away behind the supercomputer where he had prepared everything to short-circuit Hannibal Mago's command box. The box was now in Gregory's hands, and he had no way of taking it from him. But his system could still prove useful. Jeremy raised one of the floor panels and removed the safety fuses from the device that he had assembled. The boy's hands worked at full speed. He had studied these circuits all afternoon and knew them like the back of his hands. The only thing he was missing was a simple, electrical overload. That way, the supercomputer would disperse the excess energy into the ground, then rid of the faulty circuit and automatically bring things back to their normal state. Jeremy disconnected one of the alternator's cables, paying extra attention to touch only the rubber insulation. He had a moment of doubt. Would their rubber soles be enough to protect them from the current? What would happen to his friends on Lyoko? With the cable tight between his fingers as if he were gripping a venomous snake, the boy poked his head out from behind the tower. Gregory had gotten a bit closer to Memory, who seemed terrorized. The gun was clearly trembling between her hands. "Come on, play nice," said the man. "Give me the gun before you hurt yourself." Jeremy made his decision and pressed the cable against the base of the supercomputer. Immediately afterwards, a small cloud of black smoke rose from the device. Then, it sparked. The metal became illuminated by a bright blue light. Memory gave a small shriek and Gregory fell to the ground like a sack of potatoes. Jeremy felt the hair on his arms stand up. "Watch out!" Memory cried out. "Don't move." Gregory's body spasmed on the ground before falling flat from the discharge, and Jeremy realized that the soles of his shoes had melted from contact with the metal tiles due to the heat. He needed to give them a yank to unstick them. Less than 2 seconds more had passed before a series of clicks warned them that the supercomputer had put its security system in place. The tiles instantly regained their natural color. "Thanks," said Memory, turning towards Jeremy, letting the gun fall to the floor. The boy approached Gregory. The man's eyes were closed and he no longer seemed too dangerous. "He's unconscious. Help me tie him up before he recovers." Lone Wolf's feet were finally out of Richard's face, allowing him to breathe again. The ventilation shaft was so low and narrow that the back of his uniform was reduced to shreds, and the smell of sweat from the feet of the men in black agent in front of him had passed by Richard's nose too many times. He saw the agent land on the ground with a jump. He had detached the grill at the end of the tunnel, and made his way out to look around. "Is anyone there?" whispered Richard. "Come on out. The path is clear." The young man finally made it to the end of the tunnel, and Lone Wolf helped him out. Then, he turned around to give a hand to Hertz and the others. Richard looked all around. He was in a large room, full of imposing machines. The enormous hunks of metal were all shut down, and the control panels were covered in large cloaks of dust. Drops of water fell on them from the ceiling, and had made the floor smelly and slippery. "Where are we?" he whispered. "Under the dining room that we saw earlier," Professor Hertz replied to him. Lone Wolf nodded. Before beginning the mission, Dido made us learn the entire layout of the factory by heart. We are now in the turbine room, and if we continue this way, we should make it to a service tunnel that will lead us directly to the first floor underground. We're on the same level. Richard observed all the tired faces of the people that were with him. They were all well armed, but he wasn't sure that they'd be able to manage. "What are you planning on doing?" he asked. "We get to the control room, we eliminate the opposition, and we take control of this place," Lone Wolf replied with a smile. "We begin to fight." Richard gave a long sigh. This was exactly the response he was afraid to hear. The children had already arrived at the tower. It was in the desert sector, full of golden sand that disappeared beyond the horizon. Even though it wasn't hot. On Lyoko, the temperature was always the same. There weren't seasons. It never rained. It was as if time didn't pass. And the sand never moved with the wind. Odd narrowed his eyes to look at Eva in the clear sky, who was turned towards him. The young girl seemed to be some sort of rock music sorceress, and Odd loved that. Of course, she wasn't really the same Eva that he knew from Katic. But still, he preferred the real her more with her Yankee accent that altered all her words and made his head spin, a lot. "Hurry up," the boy cried out without descending from his panther. "We're just missing you." Eva nodded and leant forward on the guitar, nosediving at an insane speed. She pulled up at the last moment, just before crashing into the ground, then finally jumped off the guitar with a cheerful smile. "Wow," she exclaimed. "This is the best thing that's ever happened to me." But Odd continued to look fixedly at the sky with a worried expression on his face. Large, dark clouds were beginning to form on its once uniform surface. "What is it?" commented Eva, breaking out in laughter. "Afraid of a storm?" "There are never storms on Lyoko," murmured the boy. He turned towards his friends. All of them were already inside the tower, except for Ulrich, who was waiting for them atop the back of his manta ray. He also looked to the sky. "Oh," he said. The clouds were gathering right above their heads, becoming darker and more menacing. Then lightning began to clash. The first bolt reached the tower, making it shimmer in a million sparks. The second fell right by the feet of Odd's panther, leaving a dark crater on the terrain. The boy leapt to the side thanks to the agility of his animal. "I don't understand. What the heck is Jeremy doing? First, they shut down the supercomputer. And now this." "The important thing," Ulrich answered, "is that we get materialized as soon as possible." Eva nodded. "He's totally right. Let's head back to the tower. Xana's waiting for us." The second underground floor in the factory was being guarded by 6 soldiers sat in a circle beside the scanners. 3 of them were European and discussing the scores to the most recent football games. The others were Asian and quietly speaking about buzkashi, a violent game from their native land similar to polo, except instead of competing to get a ball, they compete over the buzz, a goat carcass without a head or limbs. The soldiers were very bored. They had been there for hours, without moving, in front of these scanners, without even having a simple television set to watch. There hadn't been the usual shift change, so they were forced to skip dinner. "I don't get it," exclaimed one of them, getting to his feet. "Why is no one coming? Our shift already ended a while ago." Another, who had been speaking in Mongolian up until now, immediately switched to French. "Try to stay calm. You know how things work when we're given a mission." Suddenly, a whirring sound could be heard, and the soldier turned towards the scanners. He aimed his submachine gun in the same direction. "What's going on?" he murmured. The man had worked for Green Phoenix for years. He had fought in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. At this point in his life, he was convinced he'd seen everything. But he wasn't prepared for this show. Sat atop his panther, Odd was the first to exit the scanners. "Yeahhhhhh," he cried triumphantly. Xana's plan had worked. Thanks to the pendant, he had been materialized in the real world in his feline form. And on the back of a panther. The boy noticed the presence of the soldiers. One of them was on his feet and pointing his gun in his direction. "Laser arrow," cried out while firing a barrage of small blades of light from his fists at the man. The soldier began firing bullets that flew very close above Odd's head, ricocheting off the walls of the room. After that, the laser arrows hit their target, throwing him into the wall. Arrows had bolted his uniform to the wall, and the barrel of the gun was cut in half. The man uttered something in an unknown language, but Odd wasn't paying attention to him. The panther jumped against one of the walls of the room and turned around, while the boy began to fire. Another barrage of arrows. He saw that Ulrich had come out of the second column and Yumi from the third. The young samurai had already unsheathed his sword and was about to confront one of the soldiers as Yumi opened her fans. "There's only 6, protested Odd. "Leave them to me." With his Lyoko powers, he felt capable of taking on an entire army. Ulrich hopped off his manta ray, slashed apart the guns of 2 soldiers, and took them down in several kung fu moves. "Yumi and I will take care of the guys over here, then we'll head to the entrance of the factory. Go with Eva and Alita to the first underground floor, and take over the command post." Alita then came out from the scanner on her unicorn at full gallop. The creature lowered its horn, forcing one of the soldiers to the ground, and Yumi immediately attacked him. "Roger that," said Odd, seeing that Eva was also exiting the scanner. "Come with me. We must reconquer the supercomputer." Deep within the turbine room was a half-rusted, iron panel. Richard was remaining there to keep watch while Lone Wolf, Weasel and Ferret were picking the lock closing off the passageway and trying to push the metal cover off. Behind the panel was a vertical tunnel. It was a sort of dark and humid, thick, cement channel, just over 1.5 meters in diameter, that went on further than the eye could see, descending down towards the second and third floors underneath the factory. Just in front of them, on the opposite wall of the channel, was a closed door. It was the entrance to the control room where the command post was for the supercomputer. The only thing left to do to reach the door was to jump without thinking too much of the size of the tunnel. They needed to latch onto one of the supports on the other side to climb up and finally open the iron panel. "It's starting to really smell," commented Walter Stern. "We won't be able to all enter at the same time." "No," confirmed Lone Wolf. "One of us will need to get to the other side and open the door. The others will stay here to cover them in case the terrorists are waiting for us." Hertz and Lone Wolf discussed a plan of attack for a moment, while Richard and Michael Belpois went to search for necessary materials. They found a coil of electric cables under a large panel. It was thick enough to support the weight of an adult man. They returned to the entrance of the tunnel, struggling with the weight of the coil, and helped Weasel attach himself to the cable around the waist. Then, the agent suspended nearly his entire body above the abyss of the well and jumped towards the other side. The cable moved behind him like the tail of a distraught animal. Weasel reached out his arms and missed the first support by a hair, but immediately managed to grab hold of a lower one. He turned towards Richard with a big smile on his face. "Perfect," he said, trying to catch his breath. "I'll climb as quickly as I can." The agent climbed up to the door that connected the turbine room to the supercomputer's controls. Lone Wolf observed him with his gun ready. By his side was Professor Hertz, and behind him, Richard and Walter Stern. The Ishiyamas and Michael Belpois, who were also armed, were waiting to the side of the others. The agent brought a hand towards the lever to open the door, but it moved before he could touch it. The metal panel slid to the side, revealing a narrow passageway from which a gun immediately opened fire. Lone Wolf and Hertz immediately threw themselves to the ground. Richard lowered his head so that a barrage of bullets flew above his shoulders, creating a ton of sparks against the gigantic turbine behind him. 2 seconds later, the young man managed to reopen his eyes. The command room was so close. Richard saw the seat pivoting and the semi-transparent, colored globe that was floating in front. Lyoko. But the room was full of soldiers, and all of them were armed and ready to fight with all their might. At their lead was a man elegantly dressed in yellow from head to toe. "Hannibal Mago," growled Lone Wolf. The agent leaned in towards the inside of the maintenance well, gave 2 blind shots towards the room, then took cover again. Meanwhile, Weasel was still in the channel, holding on tight with his body flat against the wall like a gecko in camouflage. Suddenly, the agent cried out, losing his grip on the supports, and began to fall down the abyss. Richard pulled the electric cable that was attached to the agent. The young boy felt adrenaline coursing through him. He felt like he couldn't think clearly. All around him set off a storm of shouting and bullets. He tried to stay calm. Weasel weighed too much for him, and his arms weren't strong enough to pull him up. He let the cable slide slowly through his hands, descending bit by bit. After all, the tunnel must end sooner or later, and down below, Weasel would be safe from the bullets. When Richard finally felt the cable relax, he brought his hands to his mouth and called out, "Hey man, did you make it?" Yes. There's also a door down here, but it's shut and needs a numerical security code." A new barrage of bullets forced Richard to take cover behind the wall. If something didn't happen fast, they wouldn't have the slightest chance. Hannibal Mago was furious. Something must have happened on the 3rd floor. He had sat for several minutes at the command post, but no robot had appeared to obey his orders. That damned brat, Jeremy, tried to play him for a fool. And now he had another conundrum. The prisoners were free and had somehow managed to arm themselves. It was too bad they found themselves on the other side of the well, however. From there, they were nothing more than simple human targets. Hannibal Mago saw one of his soldiers fall back, hit in the arm by a projectile. He took a weapon in his hands, an AK-47, took a step towards the tunnel, and unloaded it on his adversaries. Then, he stood petrified. What the hell was he doing? The priority was to keep himself safe. His men would take care of the intruders. He made a U-turn towards the lift and saw the door slide open to the side. The man smiled, expecting to see the rough face of Gregory Nictopoulos. But instead, there were 3 strangely dressed kids. One was riding a panther, the other was atop a unicorn, and the third was on an electric guitar. The 3 soared into the room and attacked the soldiers. Mago threw himself to the ground and ran on all 4s as the brats dove from one side of the room to the next with the fury of an entire army. It was time to run for the hills. Chapter 17, Mago's Escape. In slow motion, Odd saw the soldier behind him lift his weapon, and in the midst of all the confusion he seemed to hear the click of the trigger. There was a deafening explosion and the boy closed his eyes, gripping the short, gleaming coat of the panther with all his might. The creature jumped, carrying him up high, and for a moment he couldn't tell which way was up. When he reopened his eyes he realized that he was still in one piece. The soldier was splayed out on the floor beneath the claws of the digital panther, complaining in a foreign language. "Yee-hee-ah!" Odd cried, his shout becoming a crazed, wild laugh. The boy quickly analyzed the situation. Alita and Eva were doing superbly. The unicorn galloped between the soldiers, throwing them to the ground with violent kicks while its elf rider threw energy fields. Eva shouted tirelessly, creating a shower of sharp notes in all colors that battered the Green Phoenix men. Some of them had already dropped their weapons and fled. Odd turned just in time to see the lift door close. In the cabin was a man dressed in yellow. "Hannibal Mago is escaping," someone yelled. The boy turned in the direction of the voice. The person who had called out was Professor Hertz, who was on the other side of the narrow opening. Odd scrutinized the door. It wasn't very large, but he made a decision. He dug his heels into the panther's flanks and lay down along its spine, his face pressed against its soft fur, trying to stay as low down as possible. The creature immediately understood his intentions and crossed the room at a dizzying speed while Mago's soldiers leapt out of the way so as not to be barreled over. The panther leaned over the opening, angled its head, stuck its paws out in front and jumped. It flew across the meter-and-a-half wide, vertical tunnel and landed on the other side, between the turbines. Odd greeted the Ishiyamas. Then he saw Richard and his face lit up. "Would you happen to know if we can go down from here?" Why yes. Richard babbled, a distraught expression on his face. "We came through the ventilation shafts, but I mean, there are stairs." "Perfect," exclaimed Odd. "In that case, hop on." "But where?" "Well, on the panther's back, of course. We're going to give Mago what's coming to him, once and for all." Ulrich and Yumi approached each other and took one another's hand. Then they smiled and embraced. "You did great," said Ulrich, his gaze drawn to the girl's deep, dark eyes. "I'd say that we both did amazingly," she responded with a smile. And indeed they had. All the soldiers in the scanner room had been neutralized. They were now all in a corner, tied up in pairs. Each soldier carried a pair of handcuffs on their belt, and they had proven very useful for the children. Ulrich's manta ray was on the floor, and now seemed like a large, orange rug. The silver fox was beside it, its head between its paws. "So what do we do now?" Yumi asked. Ulrich shrugged and thought about it for a moment. "Let's go to the factory ground floor and finish the job." The lift was in use. The children pressed the call button and waited impatiently for the door to open. When the container finally brought them up with the low sound of the creaking of cables and the door opened, they were greeted by a very real war zone. There were dozens and dozens of soldiers shooting at one another, hiding behind piles of metal beams or taking cover behind trolleys of equipment and enormous bobbins of cables. Some of them were dressed in the Green Phoenix's green uniform, and others wore neoprene wetsuits and large, bulletproof vests of the same color. Yumi let out slow breath, stupefied. "Let's join the battle," encouraged Ulrich. The little samurai jumped onto his manta ray and drew his katana. A throwing knife as sharp as a razor blade hurtled towards Ulrich, and the boy sliced right through its middle with a perfectly calculated, two-handed swing of his sword. He then plunged headfirst into the melee of bodies, shouts and bullets. Dido and Principal Delmas were in the science laboratory. The woman, who wore a pair of large headphones that hid her ears, kept her eyes riveted on her computer monitors. By her side, Delmas silently observed everything, seated on a chair far too small for his stature. The principal was afraid. Dido knew this and she too was afraid, but there was no going back. The clock on the wall in front of them showed that it was 18 minutes past midnight. The image on the main monitor trembled for a moment, to then draw the lines that made up Maggie's face. "So," said Dido tautly after letting out a sigh. "We've received the preliminary report from Aerial Squadron 1 and Infantry Squadron 3. Unfortunately, there's no good news. Someone blew up the bridge between the bank and the island, and the Green Phoenix's defensive weapons prevented our Delta planes from landing on the factory roof. These two teams are now isolated outside." Dido let out yet another deep sigh. Thanks to the headphones, Principal Delmas hadn't heard a single word, but he must have figured out something after seeing her expression. The woman had her hands on her knees, tense like claws, crumpling her pants, and the veins in her forearms were beginning to swell. "And Squadron 2, she asked, not without fear. The frogmen made it to the objective. Unfortunately, the sides of the island were covered in alarms that alerted the terrorists. We lost contact with them, but thanks to Squadron 3's reports we know that a gunfight took place inside the building. Tell Squadron 3 that they need to get to the Hermitage. I want that house terrorist-free as soon as possible." Dido opened a window on the screen. It was the image of a fighter bomber, an F-16 with no distinctive markings and triangular wings loaded with missiles. Black Raven. "At what level are we in the other operation?" Dido asked. "Black Raven left our secret base in Ireland on time. It will reach the objective at the set time." "Good," commented Dido. She paused a moment to think before continuing. I want peer-to-peer radio communication to be in contact with the pilot. I'll be the only person who can communicate with him." The secretary nodded. "I sincerely hope that Black Raven will return to base with all its cargo, madam." "Yes, Maggie, I hope so too." Odd and Richard left the staircase behind them and arrived in the machine room that Mago's soldiers had turned into a lunchroom. When the panther burst into the room, all the men leapt to their feet and brandished their weapons. Odd spurred his creature. It bounded and galloped towards the row of tables with a terrifying roar. Richard responded with a small, scared whimper. It was Odd's favorite style, a classy, grand entrance. The boy stood up on the back of the panther as it ran and readied himself. While Richard continued his insane race across the tables, he grabbed onto a tube coming out of the ceiling and, using it like a gymnastic bar, he spun around, shooting laser arrows left and right. He aimed with great precision, destroying weapons, disarming the soldiers and sending throwing knives flying as they hurtled into the room like a deadly swarm. He then let himself fall, landed on the back of a soldier and knocked him upside down, ran across a table and continued to shoot arrows low to the ground. He was having the time of his life. Yumi had already figured out how things worked. The soldiers in green were the bad guys, and the ones in black were good. When she and Ulrich arrived, the ones in black were losing the battle. There were few of them, while the green Phoenix soldiers were like the heads of the Lernean Hydra. However, the two children had already shifted the balance of forces on the battlefield. It was like they were everywhere at once. Ulrich appeared in the middle of the confrontation on his manta ray, spinning his sword around like a helicopter rotor, while Yumi's silver fox flashed here and there throughout the room, dancing between shadows and stacks of beams to then attack the terrorists by surprise. The girl spotted the thin, metal columns holding up the framework of the footbridge glisten as it caught the light. Her fans cut through the air, slicing straight through the columns, as if they were made of butter before returning to her hands. The green Phoenix soldiers huddled together under the platform raised their heads, distracted by a groaning sound from above, and saw as the footbridge fell. On top of them. "Nice shot," called a voice. Yumi turned around and smiled. Odd and Richard had entered through a door. The older boy was lying on the back of the large panther, which seemed to be out of control, while Odd followed them in long jumps, pushing himself off any surface, be they horizontal or vertical. He looked like a real cat. "Watch out for the guy dressed in yellow," he immediately shouted. "It's Hannibal Mago." Yumi turned in the direction Odd was pointing, and a number of the men in black did the same, to immediately open fire. The girl saw the boss of the Green Phoenix who, hurling all sorts of colorful curses and insults, pulled out a large, silver gun from his vest to return fire at his enemies. He then hid behind a column to reload his weapon. When he came out from behind his refuge, for a fraction of a second, the man and the girl's eyes met. Mago then fired 6 times in a row. Yumi's fox bounded to the side so that the girl wouldn't be hit by the bullets, but they hit it right in the chest. "No!" Yumi cried. Beneath her, the fox transformed into a shining cascade that dissolved in the air like cinders. The geisha rolled to the floor. A new volley of shots forced her to jump to one side, to safety. Odd arrived beside her and ducked behind a trolley that lay on its side. Yumi gave the man an icy stare. "Mago will pay for that. Let's go get him." Ulrich fought with incredible ardor. The manta ray fired lasers from its tail, while the boy used his martial arts skills to attack using his sword, dodge, and kick his enemies. Richard wasn't doing too badly, either, especially thanks to the panther. "Ulrich!" Yumi called. "Odd and I will take care of Mago." The boy jumped from the manta ray in a circular kick that sent 2 soldiers to the floor. He turned and raised 2 fingers as a sign of victory. "Okay. The situation's already under control here." Yumi smiled. She and Odd then exchanged glances and both leapt from behind the trolley. The boss of the Green Phoenix had hoisted himself up onto one of the footbridges that was still intact, and was running madly for the doors leading to the offices. Odd took a running jump that landed him directly on the footbridge, bouncing off it as if his legs were springs. Yumi also did a spin in the air, grabbed onto a beam hanging from an old crane, and used it like a pendulum to join her friend. "Where'd he go?" she asked Odd once she'd reached his side. "This way." Beneath them the battle became more intense. The two children ran along the footbridge and forced open the door Mago had shut behind him seconds earlier. They were in a room full of gloomy-looking machines. It wasn't a very big space, although the ceiling was very high up. There was a framework of staircases that led from the room to one higher up, the last floor before arriving on the roof. "He could be hiding anywhere," whispered Odd, but his sentence was interrupted by the sound of another door closing with a clack. The two children raced up the stairs, preparing themselves for combat. Another new room with yet more machinery. This time, the ceiling was a large glass expanse that looked extravagant that way the light of the moon shone through it. Hannibal Mago, clearly visible thanks to his ridiculous canary yellow suit, was climbing along an enormous press. The boss of the Green Phoenix seemed to know this place like the back of his hand. Once he was on top of the machine, massive and covered in gray dust, he stretched up to the glass ceiling and broke one of the panes with the butt of his gun. "Stop!" Yumi shouted. She threw her two fans, but the man was quicker than her, and after heaving himself up, he made it up onto the roof, disappearing from view. Yumi got her fans back. She and Odd ran to the press Mago had climbed up and remained on their guard in case of gunfire. But the only thing that came to them from the factory roof was deep silence. The two children jumped, found the hole the man had smashed in the glass and followed him. They now found themselves on the roof of the factory. It was a sloping terrain made of metal and glass that led to the outer gutters, painted an intense gray like mercury by the moonlight. It was very cold up there and the wind blew so hard it threatened to knock Yumi off balance, slipping on the smooth soles of her wooden geisha sandals. Hannibal Mago was moving along the slope of the roof towards a small platform of red bricks a little lower down. On the platform, there was a case, a metal container on which the symbol of the Green Phoenix had been emblazoned. The man heard the noise the children made behind him and turned his head to look at them while continuing to move forward, slipping and flailing his hands like a large, scared spider. Odd made a step onto a pane of glass, causing it to make a sinister creaking sound, before quickly retreating back onto the iron supports. "Watch where you're going," Yumi said. "This thing could break at any moment." The girl removed her sandals and began to walk in bare feet, following her friend. There was too much wine for her to use her fans and Mago was too far away for Odd's arrows. They continued on in silence, putting one foot in front of the other, arms spread wide to keep their balance, like a couple of tightrope walkers. Mago moved in a disorderly fashion. He lost his nerve. He still held his gun in one hand, and the weapon bothered him. He placed one foot on a pane of cracked glass, which broke in two beneath his weight. Yumi heard a curse and saw the man get back to safety on the iron framework. Mago turned towards them again, noticed the technique the children were using, and he too began to walk on a large, imaginary rope, one slow step after the other. Odd shot several arrows, but they hit the crystalline surface without reaching their target. Meanwhile, the boss of the Green Phoenix made it to the brick platform, ducked behind the case, and returned fire. Yumi heard the gunshot, turned around and saw Odd fall backwards. The shot. It wasn't possible, Mago had managed to hit him. The Catboy became enveloped in a dense cloud of blue sparks and disappeared. The girl fixed her gaze on the boss of the Green Phoenix, glaring with complete loathing. She knew that Odd would just appear back in one of the factory scanners, completely unharmed, but she couldn't stop thinking about what would have happened to her friend had he not possessed his Lyoko powers. She growled. Mago threw his gun to the side and busied himself opening the case. From it he took a strange metal backpack with large tubes on the lower part. He frantically donned the device, threading his arms through the stiff braces, which he then attached to his upper thighs, and seized a rectangular object that was connected to a side of the backpack by a cable. It seemed just like a video game controller. Mago pressed a button, and the metal backpack lit up with a low noise, to then spit out dense flames from its lower tubes. Finally Yumi understood what it was, a jetpack. She had seen them in films, but she had never thought that something like that could truly exist. The boss of the Green Phoenix pressed another button, and with a crack, from behind his shoulders opened two small wings. He then flew up a few meters. The jet from his propulsion units made the glass part of the roof around him explode into tiny pieces. Hannibal Mago was going to escape without even a scratch. Yumi breathed deeply and began to run on the thin metal beam. She then did a cartwheel with more style than a professional gymnast, and landed on the brick platform. The girl, who was now right behind the man, jumped up and threw her fans. But Mago had noticed her maneuver and spun around, making a tight turn in the air. The fans missed their target and quickly returned to Yumi. The terrorist boss pressed the buttons on the box in his hands and propelled himself backwards. From his throat came a mad laugh, like he was cawing in triumph. "See you never, brat." For a split second, Yumi saw the light reflect off his golden canine teeth, and then the man turned back around and began to fly off the factory roof and towards the river, gaining speed. He was escaping and Yumi could no longer stop him. But as soon as he arrived at the gutters, Hannibal Mago heard the sound of fire erupting, accompanied by the disgusting stench of petrol. He had forgotten the flamethrowers he had installed to prevent possible aerial attacks. The boss of the Green Phoenix let out a cry. He quickly manipulated the jetpack controls, and the backpack zoomed upwards just as one of the jets of fire gushed out beneath his feet. He instinctively raised his hands to protect his face. This would prove to be a huge mistake. At first, Yumi didn't understand what was happening. She saw the man hurriedly change direction to climb up into the sky, while the factory roof burst alight beneath him, creating a compact wall of fire. Then, all of a sudden, triggered by the dense smoke that rose from the lower part of his jetpack, Mago started to spin around and around at high speed. The boss of the Green Phoenix flew far above the wall of flames and off into the sky, drawing behind him a trail of light like a comet. The flamethrowers extinguished with the same speed they had lit, and in the darkness that flooded the night, Yumi saw Hannibal Mago lose altitude and arc into the silent river, sending up a great splash of water.
The Lyoko Warriors finally get to battle on Earth in awesome fashion, but Mago's escape was kind of weird. I slow to begin realizing I won't be able to get the books done by the time I have my own new place. But I will finish it when I can. We're slowly, steadily coming to the conclusion of the book, and even the series. So be sure to comment, like, and subscribe, and stay tuned for more episodes. We'll see you all next time.